Well, as we gather together today, we pick up in Mark's Gospel, chapter 14. We're going to be looking at verses 53 down through verses 65. This is the arrest and trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. We have just come off of his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and has been taken away. And in this story today, we're going to be going over his trial in front of the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the religious establishment of Jesus' day. But before we get into this passage, I want to have a reminder of what Jesus had taught the disciples several chapters before. In fact, he repeated this lesson 3 times in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And I want to look at the last teaching that he gave to his disciples in chapter 10 regarding the events that are happening right now in this moment as we're reading this. So let's go back to chapter 10, Mark 10, verses 32 through 34. So turn back to Mark 10, verses 32 through 34. Do you have it? Yeah, okay. Let's listen to what Mark has to share with us in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 34. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later he will rise." And this is the teaching of the suffering servant that Jesus worked with the disciples very closely on in chapters 8, 9, and 10. He kept reminding them. This was the third reminder of what was going to happen. And of course, the disciples struggled with this. We spent a great deal of time talking about this, the struggle that the disciples had with the suffering servant. This wasn't the way the Messiah was supposed to come into being. This is not the way the Messiah was supposed to bring freedom to the nation of Israel. They were expecting a warrior king. They were expecting someone to come in and kick the Romans out. And so this whole suffering servant piece has been the underpinning of these last several chapters, and this understanding of Jesus being the Messiah and what that Messiah means, as opposed to the disciples' understanding of the Messiah and what the Messiah means to them. But now in this story in chapter 14, we're going to pick up where these events are actually happening. What Jesus had taught them back in 8, 9, and 10 in chapter 14 is actually happening. So we're going to take a look at chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark, verses 53, and we're going to go down through 65. I want to read down through that passage in its entirety, and then we'll go back and we'll take a look at it. So let's listen to the word of the Lord from Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 53. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made by human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands.' Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus, 'and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.' The high priest tore his clothes. 'Why do we need any more witnesses?' he asked. 'You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." And thanks be to God for the reading of this word. This is the trial. This is what Jesus has been talking about since chapter 8 with the disciples. This is the destination, the place that Jesus has been heading towards since the beginning of time, really. Yes, you can say 33 years ago when he was born in the manger in Bethlehem, that's where he was heading. But really in the beginning of time, when the Spirit of God hovered over the waters of creation, this day was already in the works. This day was already planned out and going to happen. And so when we take a look at this, we understand that we're not only looking at something that's happening in that moment, we're not only looking at something that's going on in real time, we're also looking at something that's a part of a much bigger picture, something that's a part of a master plan, something that in essence, when we get right down to it, has to happen, even though it's unfair, even though it's cruel, even though it's painful, it has to happen. It's a part of the plan. And that larger divine plan is something that we wrestle with in our faith. That's something that we struggle with in our faith. Why didn't God just sit up in heaven and say, they're all saved, they're all forgiven, and let it be done? Why did he have to come as Jesus and go through this? Why do we have to have this trial? Why do we have to have the crucifixion? And those are not questions that we're going to answer today. Those are questions that we're going to wrestle with and we're going to struggle with as we journey in our faith. And the depth of our understanding will come out of the concentration that we give to it. The depth of our understanding will come out of how we pick this apart and how we start to understand the nature of God and our nature. And I'll tell you, if you're struggling with it, if you spend the time, you'll start to understand that there really is no other way that this could have come about. Yes, there are other ways that God could have done it, but they wouldn't have been as powerful. They wouldn't have been as relevant. They wouldn't have had the same effect. And so we see in this trajectory of the story that even though what is going to happen, what is happening, seems to be unfair, seems to be painful, it's a part of what must happen. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, picking up in verse 53. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders, teachers of the law, came together. So this was a large group. Now remember, we said before that we believe that Jesus and the disciples were in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus was praying for the cup to pass, but not my will, but your will be done. We believe that that was a time frame of somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight. So this is probably midnight or beyond that Jesus now is being brought before a group of people. So there's a lot of people who should be sleeping, are usually sleeping at this time, and now they are up and they're doing some official business. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. And in verse 54, we have this reference to also who else went. Peter followed him at a distance. Now remember, we know from last week that when the people came to arrest Jesus, that everyone scattered, that all the disciples left, that they all abandoned him. But we do know now from verse 54 that Peter stayed close. Remember again, we believe that Peter was the one that was giving Mark this story. Mark was not an eyewitness. Mark was a student of Peter, and he believed that it was important enough to write this down and share it into a gospel, make it into a book. And so this is Peter sharing this account to him. So of course Peter would know when he was there or when he wasn't there. And so in verse 54 it says, Peter followed him at a distance. He didn't walk with him. He didn't cheer him on. He wasn't standing by his side, but he followed him at a distance. Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priests. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. This is going to be very important because, of course, we know before they went to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus told Peter that before the rooster crows this night, you will deny me 3 times. Well, in order for him to do that, he's got to be close in proximity to Jesus. So now we know that he's in the courtyard and he's watching all of this. He's sitting with the guards, he's sitting with the other people so as not to stand out, so no one could maybe recognize him or point him out as one of Jesus's followers. So we know Peter is present. That's going to be important later on in the story. So in verse 55, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, look at your translations. Do you have the whole Sanhedrin? The whole Sanhedrin would have been roughly 70 men. The 70 men were made up the Sanhedrin. This was the ruling class of the nation of Israel, the Jewish people at this time. These were the people that kind of sat in judgment over the nation of Israel. And one of the things that was interesting in the Roman occupation is that the Roman government had this policy that when they occupied territories, they allowed the local customs, they allowed the local traditions, they allowed the local religions to continue to function just as long as the local people didn't stop paying their taxes and worshiping the emperor. As long as they did those things, then they were basically given freedom to run their communities, to govern themselves as much as they possibly could. Now, there were certain things they couldn't do, and we'll learn this later in the story. One of the things that they couldn't do is they could not kill criminals. They could not convict someone to die and then actually carry out the death sentence. Only the Roman government can carry out the death sentence. So we will understand this later on in the story, but it's important for us to understand that at this time, the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin, the ruling class of the nation of Israel, was well within their rights with what they were doing. Yes, it was strange, because I think anybody would think it was strange if a court came together at like midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning to have a trial behind the scenes, but it was legal for them to come together and do this. They weren't breaking any Roman laws. So the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. They were looking for evidence against Jesus. So this gives us a very clear picture of what this trial is going to be all about. This trial is not to find out, is there guilt or is he innocent? That's not about it. The trial is, we've already convinced ourselves that he's guilty. Now we've just got to put a legal stamp on it. Now we've just got to make his guilt legal now. So they weren't looking for innocence. This wasn't a, innocent until proven guilty kind of situation. This was, you are guilty. Now we've got to figure out a way to make that guilty stick. So they came together, as it says here, looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. They did not find any. So we have this court that has been put together. The Sanhedrin, 70 men are there, plus the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. All of these people are there. And what they're doing is they're going to be calling witnesses to come and testify against Jesus. You can almost picture it in your mind right now. Jesus kind of standing in this little box, and he's handcuffed, and he's kind of looking straight at the group of Sanhedrin that are out in front of him. And he's just kind of standing there quietly while these people are going to come and they're going to testify against him. The problem is that they could not find anything to convict him. They couldn't find a testimony to convict him. It says, so they wanted to put Jesus to death, but they did not find any. 56, many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Their statements did not agree. Do you have that? Yeah, did not agree. This is important because in Jewish law, remember, this is a group that already believes that Jesus is guilty, so they're just trying to legally make him guilty so that they can put him up for death. But in the law of Israel, there had to be at least 2 witnesses that agreed in testimony. So if you and I were called to testify against somebody and I said, yeah, they came to the intersection, they made a left-hand turn and they were going about 75 miles an hour, and then they crashed into the house and they killed the people in the house. And then you came and said, yeah, they came, I think they turned to the right, they were going about 60 miles an hour and they crashed into the house. They would say, sorry, we can't convict that person because your testimonies do not agree. The testimonies had to agree. The different people had to come together and they had to agree. And this is an important fact in this story because we have to understand that for a very long time, the leaders of Israel have been trying to figure out how they were going to get Jesus, how they were going to kill Jesus, how they were going to get rid of him. And you would think with all that planning, they would have thought ahead and they would have planted some witnesses. They would have planted some people to say, okay, tonight we're going to have this trial. This is what you need to say, memorize it. And then say to someone else, this is what you need to say, memorize it, so that the testimonies could agree, so legally they could kill Jesus. But they didn't do that. Why? Because this was something rather quick. We've got to remember the leaders of the church hadn't planned on arresting Jesus during the Passover feast. They didn't plan on arresting Jesus during this festival of unleavened bread where all of these people are in Jerusalem, for they were afraid politically that the people would rise up against them. So they hadn't planned on doing it. They planned on doing it after. Like as everybody was leaving town, they said, we'll slip in and we'll get Jesus while everybody's going away, and no one will figure it out. But when Judas came to them and said, I'll hand him over, they couldn't resist. They couldn't turn this down. So this played out pretty quickly. So they didn't have an opportunity to get witnesses to agree. They didn't have an opportunity to tell people what story they needed to tell during this trial. And so we have this notion, this understanding that this is kind of happening off the cuff. It's happening after midnight. They hadn't had a chance to really plan ahead for it. So Jesus is being tried here, and they can't find witnesses to agree. Their stories are not lining up. And if they can't get a story to line up, then you can't find someone guilty. So it says, many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. In verse 57, then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. Now, this is a direct reference if you turn back to Mark chapter 13, verse 2. So go back to Mark chapter 13, verse 2. Mark chapter 13, verse 2. If you remember, we've just come off the story at the end of chapter 12 of Jesus and his disciples sitting outside of the temple, watching the people coming and going and seeing them as they're making their offerings. And he sees all these rich people throwing big chunks of money and change into the offering bins. And then they see this widow come and just throw these little 2 mites into the offering plate. And he talks about how she has given more than the rich people because she gave everything. And that's where they are. So they're sitting outside the temple gates, outside the courtyard where the people are going in and out for worship. And as they're sitting out there in chapter 13, we have this account. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Now remember, they're leaving the temple, so there's lots of people coming and going. There's people all around. Now Jesus is not addressing the crowd, but we mentioned at that time that there's a possibility that people were overhearing what Jesus was saying because he was in a crowd. It was like being in a very crowded shopping mall or something like that, and where there's people coming and going all around, so it could be overheard. What magnificent buildings. And in verse 2, Jesus says, do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. So he gives this account, and when he gave this account, we talked about the fact that could get him in trouble. This conversation about destroying the temple. And so it was important for us to understand at that time that some people could have heard this. Well, obviously some people did. So they have this account of this testimony. Then some, in verse 57, back in chapter 14, then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. Yet, in verse 59, even their testimonies did not agree. Well, why did their testimony did not agree? Because that's not what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say. There was an addition to that. They kind of took that and spun it a little bit and kind of threw a little caveat in there that Jesus didn't share. Yes, Jesus did say publicly, did say to his disciples in a public setting, look at these magnificent buildings, look at all these stones, not one will be left unturned. Basically, this temple was going to be torn down. Yes, he did say that, but he did not say in that passage that he will destroy the temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. And so they couldn't get exact agreement. Yes, they could get agreement that witnesses said, I heard him say that this temple was going to be destroyed, but they couldn't get exact agreement. So again, falling flat on their face, they did not have enough testimony to convict him. Now remember, all of this is going on, and what is Jesus doing? Jesus is standing there. He is totally silent. He's probably, his hands are probably bound, and he's just standing there in front of the Sanhedrin, and he's not saying a word, and all these people are bringing this testimony against him, and nothing is sticking because none of their testimony can agree. So then in verse 60, the high priest stood up. Now this is the chief potentate. This is the big guy, the high priest. The high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. And there's an intentionality to this. It's important for us to realize and to understand why Jesus was silent. And in order to do this, we've got to go back to the Old Testament. So I want you to go back right now to Isaiah chapter 53. You're going to look for Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament. When you turn back to the Old Testament, in order to find Isaiah, if you go to Psalms, you make a right, and that'll bring you to Isaiah. So Isaiah, and we're going to look for chapter 53. Isaiah had a lot to say. Chapter 53, and we're going to look specifically at verse 7. Verse 7 of Isaiah 53, and the context of what we're looking at here in the Old Testament, this prophetic word that was written and spoken some 500 years before Jesus was ever born. The context is here that, but Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. So the chief priest basically directs his conversation right at Jesus. No more was it about the witnesses. It was right to Jesus. And he's saying, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you going to say anything? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. So the question is, why did Jesus remain silent and give no answer? And the answer for that question can be found in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. Do you have it? Okay, let's take a look at it. Isaiah 53, 7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And Isaiah 53 is the suffering servant song. It's the one that talks about the Messiah as a suffering servant. It's the one that Jesus is leaning on and has been leaning on throughout his ministry. This is the Messiah. This is the understanding of who the Messiah is going to be. He's going to be silent before his conviction. He's going to be silent before the people who are accusing him. And so carrying that prophecy out here in Mark chapter 14, Jesus hasn't spoken a word yet. You figure Jesus hasn't talked since the Garden of Gethsemane when he had looked at the people who were arresting him and he said, why do you come with me with swords and clubs? I've been in the temple all week and you haven't done a thing. That's the last time we have a record of Jesus speaking. So it's a possibility that an hour or more have gone by and Jesus hasn't spoken a word. He's been wrongly accused. We have witnesses that are sharing testimony that are false and they can't agree, and he's not saying a word. So the chief priest finally calls him out and says, aren't you going to say anything? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Notice the difference in the questions. The first questions where Jesus was silent are very different than the second questions that he's going to ask that Jesus will not remain silent for. The first questions are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Not all questions need to be answered. Not all questions have to be dealt with. Some questions are so stupid. Some questions are being asked rhetorically in such a way that your answer doesn't matter. Your answer can't have any impact at all on anything. So it's better for you to just remain silent. So Jesus remained silent when the questions are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Because the testimony is false. These people are making this all up. What Jesus will answer is when the chief priest asks a specific pointed question. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? In verse 62, Jesus speaks. The first time he speaks in this mock trial. And he starts off with the words, look at your translations, I am. Do you have that? This is significant because this is the name of God. This is the name of God from the Old Testament. When Moses was before the burning bush and the voice of God was coming out to him, he said, I am the God of your fathers. I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so this I am, this great I am, has been the name of God since the Old Testament. And so he's basically declaring his godship right here when he's saying, I am, said Jesus. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The Son of Man references what Jesus has been calling himself all through the Gospel of Mark. And we've been talking about the reference that this was. And we're going to take a look. Now we're going to turn back to the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Again, if you still have your finger or your bookmark in Isaiah, go to the right and you'll get into Daniel. Daniel was another one of the prophets of the Old Testament. And so we're going to be looking at Daniel, and we're going to be picking up in chapter 7 of Daniel. Daniel, many of you might remember Daniel in the lion's den. This is the same Daniel. This is chapter 7, and we're going to be looking at verses 13 and 14. Now remember, the context of what we're looking at in Daniel is this statement that Jesus has said to the high priest. I am, Jesus said, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And so that's the context of what we're looking at in Daniel. Remember, Jesus is fulfilling all that has been. Jesus isn't doing something new. He didn't come to start a new religion. He didn't come to start a new church. He came to fulfill that which God has always been doing. So it's important for us to make connections with the Old Testament because he is the fulfillment of what was spoken of in the Old Testament. So we're going to look at Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. 13 and 14, let's see if I find it here. All right, you have it? All right, let's read along. In my vision at night I looked. This is Daniel speaking. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This is the reference that Jesus is talking about when he makes this comment back to, or this answer back to the high priest. I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man from Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And so this is a reference from the Old Testament. This is, again, Jesus declaring to everyone who has ears to hear, everyone who's going to be listening, which, by the way, the high priest and the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, they're not going to be listening. But anybody who has ears to listen, what he's saying is that I am fulfilling that which has always been. I'm fulfilling the prophecy of the Old Testament. And so he makes this reference back to Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. So Jesus finally speaks. And what does Jesus do? Jesus speaks that he is the Messiah. Finally, in chapter 14, verse 62, the messianic secret of Mark is finally broken. Through all of the Gospel of Mark, as we've been studying, we've been talking about the fact that Jesus does these wonderful things. He'll heal somebody and then say, shh, don't tell anybody. He'll do these miracles and say, shh, don't say anything. And we talked about the fact that, number one, who's not going to say anything? Even if he tells you not to say anything, how can you not? You woke up that day and you were crippled and now you're perfectly healthy and you're walking. Everyone's going to notice, so you're going to have to give an explanation. But also, too, we talked about the fact that for Mark's community, it was important for Mark to focus their attention on the crucifixion and the resurrection. Basically saying that if Jesus came and lived for that 33 years and he had that 3 years of ministry, and during that 3 years of ministry, he did all the miracles, he taught all the teachings, he did all the healings, but he never died on the cross and rose again, then he would just be a really cool dude. Conversely, if Jesus came for that 3 years of ministry and he taught nothing, he healed nobody, he performed no miracles, but he died on the cross and rose again on the third day, he would be our Lord and Savior. And so what Mark is saying to his community through his messianic secret is, don't get lost in the sauce. Don't get lost in all the glitz and the glamour and the flash. That's really cool that he healed people and his teachings are wonderful. But don't miss the bigger picture. Don't miss the importance of what he's doing. He's come to fulfill the prophecy. He's come to bring everything full circle back to where it was intended in the beginning of creation. And so now in chapter 14, verse 62, this messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark is done because Jesus has proclaimed to the Sanhedrin, he's proclaimed to the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, the religious establishment of his day, that he is, as he says, I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now again, remember I said the high priest wasn't listening. So in verse 63, the high priest tore his clothes. This is a sign of mourning. This is a sign of disgust. He would tear your clothes. I have no idea why anybody would do that. I don't understand the background of the tradition. I would never do that myself because then you have to go buy new clothes. But this is what they did in Jesus' day. When they were mourning, when they were in disgust, they would tear their clothes. It was basically a sign of disgust with the person that you're dealing with or the situation you're dealing with. So the high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. So basically they've been bringing these witnesses before Jesus. They can't get them to agree, so they can't convict him. But now Jesus out of his own mouth has blasphemed. Jesus out of his own mouth has said, I am the Messiah. And he tears his clothes and he says, why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? Do you have a pen, pencil, highlighter? Underline that question. What do you think? This is such an essential question for us in our relationship with God. And that's such an essential question for us on our journey of being a faithful follower of Jesus. What do you think? Not what do I think? Not what does the church think? Not what does that theologian think? Not what does that commentary say that you read online? But what do you think? And this is important. Each and every single one of us in our relationship with Jesus Christ at some point has to come to a place where we say, this is what I believe. Not this is what I've been taught, or this is what I've heard, but this is what I believe. We've got to claim it for ourselves. And so what the chief priest is doing here, even though he's not listening to Jesus, even though he's not understanding what's happening right in front of him, he's giving us a very profound question for us to chew on, for us to understand, and for us to dig into in our lives. And that is, what do you think? Not what does the church say, not just what your pastor say, but what do you think about this whole thing? And this is so essential for us. So I want you to underline that or highlight that, because that's our question. That's our question that we need to ask every day. What do I think about this Jesus? What do I think about this crucifixion? What do I think about resurrection? What do I think about heaven? What do I think about the nature of God? What do I think about forgiveness? What do I think about grace? So there's this understanding of we've got to tackle these things, because at some point this faith has got to become yours. It can't be mine. It can't be the church's. It can't be somebody else's. It's got to be yours. You've got to claim it. And so this chief priest, even though he's totally focused in the wrong direction, gives us probably one of the greatest questions we could ever ask, and that is, what do you think? And so he tears his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asks. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. So basically they took a vote, a show of hands, say aye, whatever they did at that moment. And so all the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, the Sanhedrin, and we're talking over 70, probably close to 100 people, all said, kill him. So they all condemned him as worthy of death, not because of the witnesses, not because of the trial, not because of the process, but because of his declaration of the truth. When Jesus said, I am the Messiah, then that was enough in their minds to convict him, because they didn't believe he was the Messiah. Because after all, the Messiah can't be this guy. The Messiah is supposed to be the warrior king. The Messiah isn't someone that just hangs around with 12 guys from Galilee. The Messiah isn't a guy that hangs out with prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors. The Messiah is the warrior king that's going to free us from Rome and is going to make us the power. Also, too, the Messiah would be someone that would be buddying up to us, the establishment, and not hanging out with the rabble, not hanging out with all those sinners. And so they all condemned him as worthy of death. Then in verse 65, then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. Now remember, at the beginning of this story today, we talked about the fact that Peter was present. So Peter is witnessing this. Peter is seeing this. But I want to end today on a reflection on who else is witnessing this. Who else is witnessing this event, this mock trial, this condemnation, this beating, this spitting, this flogging? Who else is witnessing this? Yeah, it's God. Even though it's impossible for us to do this, think for a moment. Pretend, use your imagination with me for a moment. And you are God. You are the creator of the heavens and the earth. You are in heaven. You are sitting on the throne of righteousness, and you are watching your creation unfold in front of you. You're watching your children right in front of you. And you watch as your Son, God incarnate, is facing this mock trial. You watch as your Son, God incarnate, is convicted and is beaten and spit on and flogged. And you sit there. What do you do? Now, on a human level, as human beings, being a father myself, if I saw that happening to my kid, I'd be jumping in. I'd be doing anything in my power to prevent that from happening. I'd be doing anything in my power to stop it. But the glorious, wonderful, almighty God was witnessing this. And he knew, even though it pained him, he knew, even though I believe there was a tear rolling down his cheek, he knew that this is what had to happen. And so he let it happen. And this is the part of God, I think, that we probably wrestle with the most in those little unspoken corners of our lives. And that is, how can God allow bad things to happen? And the fact of the matter is that we don't know the answer. This is a vacuum that we have because we can't answer that question. There is no one statement that blankets everything. The closest thing that we can have to a blanket statement for that is to understand that there's a bigger picture here that we can never see. And the reason why I believe in this exact circumstance, that God can sit up in heaven and watch his son be wrongly accused, watch his son be ignored, watch his son be beaten and be spit upon and mocked, is I believe that he knows that it's a part of a bigger picture. It's just one piece of something so much greater. It's one piece of something that has to happen. And so in that sense, in that place, you and I don't get to define good or bad. For reading this, any human being, regardless of your faith, regardless if you believe or not, any human being can read the account of this story and say this is bad. This person, this Jesus, even if you don't believe that he's the Son of God, even if you don't believe that he's the Messiah, you would say that this man is being wrongly accused. This man is being wrongly tried. This man is being treated horribly. This is bad. But yet God does not intervene. God does not step in and stop it. Why? The only thing that we can rest on is that there's a bigger picture here. Thus, what is happening here looks bad, but it's really good. And this is why we have this term for this day where Jesus is going to go on the cross, this day that we've entered, because remember, we believe it's past midnight, so we have moved from Thursday into Friday. And does anybody remember what the name of Friday is, the Friday before Easter? Yeah, Good Friday. It sounds so weird to say because that's the day that Jesus was nailed to a cross. That's the day that Jesus dies. That's the day that all of this mock trial and this beating and this spitting upon and this poking fun at is all happening. But it's good because it's leading us to the bigger picture. It's leading us to what has been prophesied since the beginning of time, what has been planned since the beginning of time. And so from God's perspective, yes, I'm sure it broke his heart to watch this happen to his son. I'm sure it broke his heart to watch his children, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, the Sanhedrin, the leaders of his nation, his people, basically spit upon and beat his son, the Messiah who he sent to save them. I'm sure that breaks his heart, and I'm sure there are tears coming down his cheek. But he doesn't stop it because what's happening is good. Because it's going to lead to crucifixion and resurrection. It's going to lead to salvation. It's going to lead to the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit. It's going to lead to the grace of God being given to every single person around the whole world. Every single human being that is alive has that opportunity for salvation and grace because of these events. So yes, in the moment we say it's bad, but from God's perspective, it's good. And I want you to think about that the next time that you're experiencing something in life, the next time that you're reading the headlines, next time you're going through your Facebook feed and you're seeing all this negativity. Understand that we can't never see the big picture. And maybe what you're defining as bad today, God is seeing as good. And vice versa, what you're seeing as good today, God might be up in heaven saying, that's bad. Just something to think about as we close up today. Well, I thank you for joining me. If this has been a blessing to you, I would ask that you would be so kind to share this with other people. Just share this link with anybody on your Facebook feed, on Instagram, on YouTube, whatever you want to do. That's great. Share this word of God because maybe it just might be the thing that someone else needs to hear. So until next week, when we pick up again in chapter 14 and verse 66, I pray that you stay safe and you stay sane.